Hey, everyone. Welcome to Locked On Lakers for Thursday. Brian Kamenetsky and Andy Kamenetsky. Andy, they said that Kyrie Irving is one of the more unusual and unpredictable personalities in the NBA. Is he so unpredictable that he'd leave $30 million on the table? Plus, what to look for in Thursday's NBA draft. That's all next on Locked On Lakers.
You are Locked On Lakers, your daily Los Angeles Lakers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks to everybody for making Locked On Lakers your first listen of every day, Monday through Friday, sometimes on weekends. We get this thing up bright and early for you in Locked On Lakers, the YouTube version of it, which you get subscribing there. That usually goes up a couple hours before the audio product. So it's a great way to get a head start on all the fresh Lakers content. Make another Locked On podcast your second listen of every day. We got some news around Kendrick Nunn that we'll be bringing up over the course of the show. Darvin Ham also filling out his coaching staff. That continues. And, of course, Thursday night is the NBA draft. The Lakers are reportedly trying to buy their way into the second round. With at least one pick, maybe more. But first, Andy. So Woj on Wednesday kind of broke down a little bit more of the reporting around Kyrie Irving and explained the complications of getting to LA. Earlier in the week, we discussed that. The would you, wouldn't you, after news broke that Kyrie and the Nets are at an impasse in terms of his contract, and Kyrie theoretically could find a way to leave the Nets this offseason. Woj made it pretty clear trade would be hard. All the Lakers have to offer is Russ, basically. The only way it can work. And straight up signing Kyrie would be challenging and would require him to take the taxpayer mid-level from the Lakers, which would mean he'd be taking a $30 million haircut. Is Kyrie Irving just crazy enough, as they say, Andy, to take $30 million less in order to spite his current employers?
I mean, I think Kyrie Irving is unpredictable enough to do blank. Like, I mean, really, I don't care what you're throwing out there. I will never take it off the table. But here's where I feel like the logic that Woj laid out doesn't totally hold to me. From the piece that he has up at ESPN with the latest on this impasse, quote, whatever the case, there's no significant salary cap space for Irving to sign elsewhere, though recent history suggests that might not be necessary for him to leave. Irving, 30, cost himself approximately $17 million in salary for refusing to get vaccinated a season ago, and tens of millions more in losing his signature shoe endorsement with Nike. For anyone to say with absolute confidence that Irving wouldn't choose the Lakers' $6 million taxpayer exception over his guaranteed $36 million with Brooklyn, well, it would just be a guess. And again, like I said before, he is just unpredictable enough that I would never take anything off the table. But two things. First of all, that could be just as persuasive an argument as to why Kyrie will not leave $30 million on the table.
Right, because he left $17 million on the table last year by not getting vaccinated.
And just burned $10 million more with Nike, or tens of millions more with Nike. But moreover, the reason I actually think Woj is kind of arguing against himself while acknowledging he is far closer to all of this and better source than I will ever be, I kind of feel like if it really isn't about the money, unless Kyrie feels so specifically and personally slighted by Brooklyn not bending over backwards to give him a 4-year max deal, no questions asked, as a thank you for everything he's brought them the last 3 years, I don't see why they couldn't just work out a deal somewhere between $6 million and 4-year max and call it a day. You know what I mean?
Well,
like if it's not about the money, they could theoretically just work this out.
Yeah, right. But I mean, I think it first of all, it depends a little bit on that spite. You know, it's got to be, you know, he's got to be deeply offended that, you know, that they wouldn't, you know, whether it's offering him 2 years, you know, he opts out. This is one scenario Woj talks about where Irving opts out and they give him 2 years at, I think it would be like 84 or something. But, you know, Kyrie doesn't like that. He doesn't think that's fair. And so he decides, I'm going to, I will show you, and, leaves and will sign with the Lakers. Presumably, now this from the Lakers standpoint, a Kyrie Irving scenario doesn't get any better than this.
I mean, look,
angry Kyrie takes, because he's not like going to sign like a 4-year mini mid-level or taxpayer mid-level. It's not going to be 4 and 24, which is like all the Lakers could offer.
No, honestly, I feel like if he was willing to do that, the Lakers would actually step in his way and say, we cannot in a good conscience do it. Like, we need an intervention of sorts. Like, this is actually spinning out of control, Kyrie.
Right. It would be
Kyrie,
quickly followed by
well-being.
Kyrie selling all of his worldly possessions and living in a van. So both of us it was Tuesday's show where we were talking about this because the news broke on Monday. We were talking about the hesitance that we both feel to giving Kyrie any kind of long-term commitment. There
is no hesitance, Brian. I wouldn't do it.
Right. Neither would I.
That's
like I would go a year. I would give him one more. I would go a year plus. I would do 2 years with Kyrie. He's that good. But I 3, 4, no, not doing that. So this, you want to talk about just something nice just landing in your lap? Say what you want about Kyrie. To the inconsistency of his playing, I sort of find him a little bit insufferable at times as a quasi-intellectual. But if he just wants to sign for you for a year and $6.6 million or whatever it is, you roll out the red carpet for that one. He still is Kyrie Irving. No. And he'd be like as highly motivated as ever to stay on the floor and do whatever so he can get a big deal, the following summer. And at least in theory.
I don't even know if he'd be motivated or not, because at that point, it's pretty clear there is no discernible logic guiding any of his moves. Right. I would just say for 1 year, $6 million, I don't care if he plays 25 games. It doesn't. He can go on like a month and a half sabbatical. Don't overcomplicate it. Why he's doing it? What do you care? Seriously, what does it matter?
But so like it is truly at that point for seeing somebody.
It ain't gonna happen. But
of course not. It's one thing to be willing to leave some money on the table, 17 million, and all that kind of stuff. No doubt Kyrie cost himself a lot of money. I until an NBA player, and I know guys have taken less. I forget who it was a few years ago, passed up an opportunity for like 12 or 13 million to play for 3. I forget, something like scenarios like that have happened. Until we actually see the scenario happen where the guy goes from 36 to 6, I'm going to say nobody's doing that. I need to see that first, and then I'll believe it. But until I do, I don't care how rich you are, $30 million is a lot of money.
Yeah, there have been rare instances of comparable situations, but for the most part, it doesn't happen. The other really interesting part of Woj's piece was just him saying that ultimately Kyrie's leverage is actually Kevin Durant, because the Nets would be worried about alienating Durant, assuming Durant is still fully on board and invested in Kyrie Irving being his teammate, and the two of them doing whatever it is they are saying they're doing in Brooklyn together as, the duo that, orchestrated this whole takeover of the Brooklyn Nets organization. Until KD has decided he's had enough of this, the Nets would be taking a huge risk in saying, we're not doing this for Kyrie. We're not giving him a deal that he wants, daring Kyrie to go out the door. They may also have decided this thing isn't going to work. And this is something I've talked about with the Lakers before. Like, there may be a point where the threat of LeBron leaving, if you don't sign player X this coming off season or trade for player Y in the following off season, because otherwise you're no longer in the LeBron business. There may come a point where you just say the LeBron business is bad business and we just can't do this anymore. Like, this does not help our franchise anymore. This does not create a team that will ultimately sell the tickets that we want to sell, all of that stuff. But until you reach that point, as Woj said, Kyrie's ultimate ace in the hole may just be Kevin Durant wanting him to be his teammate. So we'll see where it goes.
I would just like to point out the Lakers could theoretically solve all of their problems at once. You let Kyrie walk, goes to the Lakers 1 year, $6 million. Plug it into the trade machine. Durant for Westbrook. I'd even be willing to throw in a couple first-round picks if I'm the Lakers for that one. So there you go. Easy peasy. Problem solved. Let's talk about Kendrick Nunn. Opts into his deal for next season. No real surprise there, but it is, in fact, a very significant move for the Lakers. We'll explain why and obviously get you caught up on Thursday's draft. That's all next.
The one, the only NBA Jam is back. Arcade 1UP, the leader in home retro arcade games, is not only bringing the best game ever back, they have made it bigger with a Shaq Edition machine. One of the first sports games ever to feature real and digitized NBA licensed teams. No fouls, no free throws, and this time, no quarters required. Compete with friends and family through an all-new Wi-Fi leaderboard, making you more connected than ever. Pre-order now from arcade1up.com. That's up.com for an estimated early September ship date. Arcade 1UP is the place for fun. They've got classics like Golden Tee, Mortal Kombat, Finish Him, and many others starting at just $3.99. And they are giving away $399, just to make sure that is clear. They are giving away an NBA Jam Shaq Edition to a Locked On listener. This is a great, great prize. Enter for a chance to win a game console for your man cave at arcade1up.com/lockedon. That's arcade1up.com/lockedon. You got until July 8th to enter to win an NBA Jam Shaq Edition console. That is awesome. Don't miss out. Enter today. Who are you going to play with?
Kendrick Nunn, no surprise this week, opted into his second year on his Lakers deal, $5.2 million, I believe it is. Again, he said he was going to do it at his exit interview, so this does not exactly come as a surprise. But it is easy to forget how important a role he was supposed to play last year. And for a team that has very few avenues to add talent, this is essentially like signing a free agent again. This is like an extra free agent signing relative to the roster they had last year. And assuming he is healthy, I really do think it's going to be an important thing for the Lakers to have on their roster, assuming, of course, they don't trade him in between now and training camp anyway.
Yeah, I mean, he is a dynamic scorer. He can do a little bit of playmaking. He's somebody that was supposed to make the Lakers bench, because presumably that's where he was going to play last season, just more dynamic and potent. And, it would alleviate the need for, say, an Austin Reeves, Wenyen Gabriel pick and roll to become a thing. You know what I mean? Like it alleviates some of the responsibilities off Talen Horton-Tucker in terms of trying to be both a scorer and a ball handler. It keeps Austin Reeves from having to do too much, Stanley Johnson from having to do too much. Like he's a legit NBA player. He was part of a Miami team that was good, and he occasionally fell in and out of the rotation because of some defensive issues that are not uncommon for a young player, and particularly a young player in that culture. You better be damn good at what you do on the offensive side.
It is not one that is tolerant of defensive mistakes.
Right, unless you are like Tyler Hero and you are so good offensively that the team can't live without you. But we saw this past year with Duncan Robinson. He is he's a really good outside shooter, but he was not good enough. He was bad enough defensively and not good enough shooting for him to stay in the rotation. So,
but also too, they always have they're so good at finding players. Like, Duncan Robinson doesn't work out. They've got Max Strus to plug it in. Gabe Vincent steps in. They always have dudes.
For a team that
Kendrick Nunn was one of those guys,
right? But and a lot of people were surprised that Kendrick Nunn was available as inexpensively for the Lakers. But for a team that is very top heavy, with a top that in and of itself has some question marks that go beyond just Russ, Nunn is important. It's really important that assuming he's not traded, that he stays on this team and becomes somebody that can give them a reliable at least 25 minutes a game.
Yeah, he played essentially 30 in his 56 games 2 seasons ago with Miami and put up, 14 and a half points. He shot 38% from 3-point range. Very effective, and efficient, 48%, almost 49% from the floor, which is very good for a guard. There's a lot to like there. I think it's important too. You mentioned THT. Nunn is not a point guard. He is a scoring guard, not an offense orchestrator, not necessarily a distributor type player, which is, I get, one of the knocks against him. But part of the problem the Lakers have had is with that second unit and Westbrook there in the minutes that he would play with that group. Westbrook and THT are a wretched combination together. It just doesn't work. So it limits in this case what Darvin Ham will be able to do with some of his groupings, because THT and Westbrook it's not a good idea. Nunn and THT though makes
Better.
much more sense.
Yeah,
much more sense. So his presence, whether Russ is still on the roster in the fall or not, and both of us are defaulting to he will be. It is a reminder of the value that Nunn has, and right now I would say it's important that he showed up as a player, because between THT's value being relatively low to what I think the Lakers hoped, and Nunn's being as low as it really could be because he hasn't played, like, these are guys are going to have to get on the floor to reestablish some value. Andy, the Lakers added another coach. Jordan Ott came from the Nets, 4-year guy there. Any thoughts? I'll be honest, I don't know much about him other than he was a video coordinator in Atlanta. Very well respected as a young basketball mind in Brooklyn. But that's about all I know. But he's getting a promotion. He's moving up to the front of the bench with the Lakers.
Yeah, I mean, like you, I'll be honest, I don't know a ton about him. Like when Chris Gent got hired to Ham's staff, I don't know the ins and outs of Chris Gent, but he was somebody whose name I was familiar with, and I know that he had been around for a long time. And Darvin Ham himself is somebody that I've frankly been surprised it took this long to get a head coaching gig. I had never heard of Jordan Ott, but in reading what some of the people have said about him, Brian Lewis, who covers the Nets for the New York Post, a well-earned promotion of sorts for Ott. He handled last year's summer league for the Nets, was instrumental in the offense, wore several different hats on Steve Nash's staff. Then Alex Schiffer, who covers the Nets for The Athletic. Echoing Brian, I always enjoyed dealing with Jordan, had a tough role as the offensive coordinator with a lot of non-shooters playing heavy minutes. Hey, good prep for his time with the Lakers. And then also, too, I reached out to somebody who covers the Nets just for a little bit of feedback on Jordan Ott. And this person joked that, it was hard to tell exactly what Ott did with the Nets because the staff isn't known for a lot of, as this person put it, finger quotes, coaching. And that's been a bit of the knock on Steve Nash, certainly in the playoffs last season. But he's another guy, if nothing else, that has been around a while, has some experience doing this. What's interesting, though, Brian, is it's yet another, because you've got Chris Gent, Jordan Ott, Phil Handy, presumably Rasheed Wallace. It's yet another.
I mean, they, at the very least, if Sheed came, I think they're out of spaces in the front row,
right? But in terms of the whole staff,
yeah.
In terms of the whole staff, it's another hire with no head coaching experience, alongside a head coach with no head coaching experience. So that, if nothing else, is interesting because very often in these situations, you see the first-time head coach bring in an assistant who's played that role before.
Right. The Alvin Gentrys of the world, Terry
Mike
Stotts,
D'Antoni's
Mike D'Antoni, all. It doesn't look like they're going to bring in a guy like that, in part because those tend to be higher profile hires, higher responsibility hires. And Gent is, as is my understanding, Gent was hired to be the lead assistant. So you have Gent, you have Phil, you have now Jordan Ott, Quentin Crawford, as we mentioned earlier in the week, is on his way to Dallas. But it doesn't seem like, if they haven't done it by now, it doesn't seem like they're going to. Do you have any concerns about that real quick before we move on?
Concern would be overstating it. I think it's a little bit unusual, and I do wonder if at times the perspective of having done blank scenario before and being able to pass that along to Darvin Ham as he learns head coaching, because it is a different animal
It's
than being an
different.
assistant.
Sure.
I think there are times where maybe that perspective could be missed for Darvin. Just like the idea of being able to lean on somebody who's been through certain situations before. That being said, the collective experience of Ham's staff, including his own, is pretty extensive.
Yeah.
Like and there's a lot of guys who've worked together before,
Mhm.
which I think is really useful.
Yeah, it does.
So-
it indicates to me, at the very least, Andy, that they're not dictating who he hires.
No,
Because I think the
definitely not.
Lakers by now would have absolutely demanded that,
Oh my God.
2 years
Frank-
ago, Darvin Ham 2 years ago would have absolutely had to put a former head coach on the staff.
Frank Vogel must be just drinking scotch out of a bottle right now. Just looking at these hires going like, really? Seriously?
More of a paper bag, I would think. Just that much angrier. Let's talk about the draft, Andy. It's Thursday night. The Lakers don't have a pick, but they're going to try to change it. What are you expecting? We'll do that next. All right. It is widely expected that the Lakers will try to buy at least one pick in the second round of Thursday's draft. We all know what they need. They need wings, but you don't go into that situation looking for a specific position or a specific need. You do that based on, here's a player that we brought in, we really like them, and we think that in 2 or 3 years, this is going to be a rotation caliber player in the league.
Yeah, the thing that gives me confidence, assuming the Lakers are able to do this, because there's no guarantee that they can purchase that second round pick. For people who don't understand this, or I guess it's not just totally obvious, you have to purchase this from another team. Like you don't go to Amazon and pick up a second round pick. So there may be just no team willing to
even if
sell
you have
that.
prime.
Even if you have prime, like
Okay.
it's just not the way it works. So there may be no sellers out there for the Lakers. So, despite their best efforts, it may not happen, but it is widely assumed, and I'm totally on board with this assumption, that they're going to look to do it. And the good news to me is, if the Lakers are able to purchase a second round pick, their track record suggests a reasonably good chance of finding an NBA quality player in the second round, which is not easy to do. So, and they're they've been as good at that over the last decade when it comes to finding players late in the first or in the second or even undrafted. They've been as good as any team in the league in the last decade.
Yeah, and in talking to Mike Garcia on Wednesday, I think it's that kind of that magic or whatever it is, science, the art and science of recognizing the skills that will translate and not overemphasizing the ones that won't. If anybody who falls into the second round does it for a reason. If you're THT, your arms, your body is too short and your body is too chunky, but you make up for it with a lot of savvy. You get yourself into shape. Your arms are really freaking long to make up some of that difference, and you find yourself with an NBA player. But finding that thing and recognizing, can you do 2 or 3 things well enough to stay on the floor? It's not enough. If you're going to do one thing, you have to be outstanding at it. Like, not just good, outstanding. Because otherwise, if you're a good 3-point shooter, but not a great one, you can't defend, you can't pass, you're Duncan Robinson essentially, and you're being benched by Miami, even after they gave you a ton of money. So I agree with you. I hope they can find their way in, because I have a pretty good degree of confidence that if they do, that player that they select will be in the NBA in 5 years, which is not something you can say about most teams and how they draft in the second round.
Yeah, and then in the meantime, the draft itself is already getting more facelifts. There was the news that broke on Wednesday that the Pistons are trading Jeremy Grant to Portland, essentially as a salary dump, and they're opening up a trade exception for doing that on top of the cap space that they already have. You know, you've got some first round picks now and in the future that are going to be moved around a bit, but that is interesting in and of itself, first of all, because Jeremy Grant had been linked, however tangentially and improbably at times, to the Lakers as a trade target, but also the potential ripple effects from that I think could perhaps indirectly or even directly affect the Lakers.
Explain.
Well, first of all, I mean, as we know, there had always been talk about THT, Kendrick Nunn, first round pick for Jeremy Grant.
That is off the table.
Right. And that's something that had been, I think, more floated than really explored as a possibility. It's interesting seeing Jeremy Grant go to Portland as a salary dump. I know I've seen some people on Lakers Twitter react to that as if it shows that, you know, that Jeremy Grant's value wasn't that high. Therefore, why couldn't the Lakers have gotten this done? I think that's a misreading of it, because clearly Detroit valued cap space.
Right. They didn't want to take money back. They didn't want the salaries, even you give them a pick. They didn't want the salaries of THT and Kendrick Nunn on their books.
Right. I think there have been some people who saw between that and the Christian Wood deal between Dallas and Houston as a sign that premiums around the league and trades may be lower than some people expected, which means A, the Lakers could get something done, or B, why the hell hasn't Pelinka gotten something done? I would not say that these two trades are defined the same in that sense.
Yeah. No, but I do think they are a good sign kind of broadly. I'll add one more. Pat Connaughton, I think it was on Wednesday, re-upped, where picked up his option with Milwaukee for 5.7 or whatever it is. And, you can debate how much, but there are very few teams with cap space, which is one of the reasons Detroit did this, is so they can be very aggressive putting bids out on other people's free agents. The restricted guys, Miles Bridges and those types of players. And not a lot of other teams will be competing for these players. And so when you don't have a robust bunch of teams that have cap space plus exceptions, if you're a guy like Connaughton, who might be hoping to bank a little bit more money than 5.7, he's a good player, 29 years old, not going to get 15, 16 a year, but maybe a little more than that taxpayer mid. You look around the league and you say, oh gosh, they're going to be almost all the signings this offseason are going to come in people's exceptions. If I put myself in a position where I need to get that from someone, I could get squeezed and fall. My point in all this is the price for Grant wasn't crazy high. The price for Wood wasn't crazy high. A guy like Connaughton read the market and said, I may not be able to get a lot of money in another place. Maybe that means there are guys out there that think they're going to get squeezed. People are going to be pretty conservative, whatever it might be. I am slightly more optimistic when you put it all together that maybe things could set up a little better for the Lakers this offseason. And maybe we'll talk about this more on Friday, like what their pitch is to free agents, that they might be set up a little better to attract talent, that there may be a few more good names out there for the $6 million that they have to spend, stuff like that. Just slightly more encouraged.
Well, then the other part of this, though, the Jeremy Grant trade that I thought was tangentially at least connected to the Lakers, or at least possibly, is Detroit now has a ton of cap space, and they are in a position to make life difficult for teams with restricted free agents. There's already chatter about them making an aggressive bid for DeAndre Ayton, because it seems like the Suns are definitely not going to max him out. Get it, but whatever. But also, too, and I saw somebody, I can't remember who from Bleacher Report, point this out, but it was a good perception on their part. Miles Bridges with Charlotte, because you're already seeing rumblings that Charlotte may be reluctant to match a $20 million per year offer for Miles Bridges, which I think he could fetch potentially on the open.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean,
absolutely.
He is a good young player, explosive athlete. He played extremely well with LaMelo Ball. I don't know why they'd be reluctant, but if it's economically driven in ways that are more about the rest of their salary than Bridges himself, that could theoretically create a situation where, Gordon Hayward and Terry Rozier have already been linked as a possible Russ trade. But there's always that question of whether or not the Lakers would have to include a pick going to Charlotte to make that happen. I think the Lakers could be in a situation where they could revisit that framing of a deal, but say, we're not giving you a pick for this. We are going to take these contracts off your hands to free up these economics long term so you can sign Miles Bridges and feel better about it. And if you want to quibble over this, fine. The difference is once July 1st rolls around, you're going to be on the clock with any team that puts out an offer for Miles Bridges. We can make this deal with you whenever. We are not actually on a clock. You will be. So if you want to have more information before you have to make a decision on Miles Bridges, these are the conditions. Take it or leave it.
It'll be interesting to see why. So we'll regroup kind of on all these things because the landscape will change on Thursday night. A lot of people are anticipating a great deal of transactions over the course of Thursday night. So the landscape could look very different on Friday. Obviously, if the Lakers make a move, that's one thing. But even if they don't, the context of free agency, the players that are available, the guys that might be available in trades, like you talked about the Charlotte situation, all of it could look very different Friday morning. So make sure you are ready by listening to our show, because that's the best way to prepare for really pretty much anything, I think. Again, Locked On Lakers on YouTube is where you go to find the show and see it and get it early compared to the audio version. Find us at Cam Brothers on Twitter, CamAnetskyBrothers@gmail.com if you want to send us an email. The iTunes show page is another great way to communicate with us. We always love to hear from everybody and try to wrap comments into the show. So we'll see everybody on Friday.